And the wife, being very upset, she went back to the hotel room, and the husband went to the funeral director in Jerusalem and said to the funeral director that my mother-in-law, my wife's mother, had passed, and we're from Pennsylvania. How much would it cost to prepare her body to send back to Pennsylvania? The funeral director said $5,000. He said, but I can prepare her body for burial here in the Holy Lands, and it would only be $500. He said, go back and talk to your wife and decide what you want to do. The husband said, I'll pay the $5,000. The funeral director said, no, you don't understand. I said it would be $5,000 to send her back, $500 to have her burial here in the Holy Lands. The husband said, about 2,000 years ago, they buried a man here in the Holy Lands. And 3 days he arose from the dead. So I paid the $5,000 to send her back. I can't take a chance. So Pastor, I couldn't take a chance on not being here. I had a PowerPoint for you that I'm going to use. That part of it will be modified because in the translation I lost some of the images. And my guru back there said that it's because you've got an Apple and I did mine from another software, but we'll get through it. So I've written 2 books. It Was Never About a Hot Dog and a Coke, which deals with the sit-in demonstrations that the white media in Jacksonville blacked out or whited out, as the case might be. So you won't find anything about what happened 60 years ago during the summer of 1960 on the sit-in demonstrations which led to Axe Handle Saturday when we were attacked by 200 whites with axe handles and baseball bats. And the second book is called Unless We Tell It, It Never Gets Told. And it talks about those black folk from Jacksonville who not only impacted Jacksonville but impacted this country. And we'll talk in part about some of those. So I won't keep you long. Give me the next one, Eric. This is Mr. Rutledge Henry Pearson, who was my 8th grade American history teacher at Isaiah Blocker. Mr. Pearson, in teaching American history, there was an American history textbook approved for Negro high schools and Negro students in the Negro division of the Duval County school system. And Mr. Pearson told us to leave that textbook approved for Negro students at home, because he would not teach us American history from the slanted and racist viewpoints of white textbook authors and historians who only saw fit to include the names of George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington in that history book. As important as they are or were, they were not the only blacks who made salient contributions to American history. Mr. Pearson wanted us to know that and internalize that and understand that we did not take a second seat to anybody in developing this country. Give me the next narrative. He would say to us, freedom is not free. If you are not a part of the solution, you are a part of the problem. I was 11 years old in 8th grade. I started school when I was 5 and I got skipped. And as pastors will tell you, favor ain't fair. Give me the next one. I put this slide in just to show you circumstances. The gentleman on the left is named Robert Haling, and Dr. Haling was a dentist who was severely beaten. He led the civil rights movement in St. Augustine. He was severely beaten by the Klan, almost within, as the old folk would say, within an inch of his life. He was transported from St. Augustine to Brewster Hospital by Leo Chase Funeral Services. They didn't trust the ambulances in St. Augustine, didn't trust the hospital, so Mr. Chase, who had a funeral home, brought him to Brewster in a hearse, and black doctors did the emergency surgery on him, and Dr. Arnett Gerardo did the dental surgery on him. The gentleman at the right is one of the founders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which celebrates its 60th anniversary this year. SNCC, as it is called, was founded in April of 1960 at Shaw College, now Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. His name is Charlie Cobb, and he is your next door neighbor, Rev. Yes, yes. So I wanted to show Charlie as the neighbor of Mount Sinai. Give him the next one. I call American history incomplete, dishonest, and racist. And all of us, all of the learned teachers and students that we have in here, the learned deacons, the learned ministers, we have all been fed a diet of blandness and tasteless baby food over our educational life that they have called American history, and we have eaten it as if it's gourmet food. Mr. Hurst, I don't understand what you're saying. We have been lied to on the pages of American history books, and we have never challenged those lies. And what happens is our students are taught, then they go to college, they become teachers, then they are taught the same thing that they were taught, so we regurgitate that same lie over and over again. Give me the next narrative. So when I talk, I always like to be interactive. Now I'm going to ask some questions off and on over the next 2 or 3 slides. If you don't know, don't guess. Because when I leave, your friends and family members and your church members, they will laugh at you if you're wrong. So I'm going to ask a series of questions off and on. It's not intended to test anyone's IQ on American history. Well, yes, it is. Christopher Columbus is given credit for discovering America. Where did he land? Let me repeat it. Christopher Columbus is given credit for discovering the continental United States. Where did he land? We know that Ponce de Leon landed in St. Augustine, but this is the man who historians give credit for discovering America. We celebrate a holiday in October for the discovery of America. So certainly we should know where this discoverer of America landed, because we were taught that in school, right? So where did he land? The answer is nowhere in the continental United States. Christopher Columbus landed in Hispaniola, which is now Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He encountered an indigenous group of people called the Taínos, part of the Arawak Indians. Arawak indigenous people, not Indians. The Tainos were peace-loving people. They didn't even have weapons. And Christopher Columbus immediately enslaved the Tainos, sending the young girls back to Italy and Spain as sex slaves. There were 300,000 Tainos on Hispaniola. In 50 years, they had all been wiped off the face of the earth. Christopher Columbus was the first slave trader in this hemisphere. And his son Diego was the first slave trader of African flesh. In the early 1930s, a delegation of Italian Americans and a group from the Knights of Columbus went to Franklin D. Roosevelt and said, "Mr. Roosevelt, we would like for you to consider naming a national holiday for Christopher Columbus. Italian Americans are getting a bad rap in the paper because of the images of the mafia and the syndicates and others. And we think that you should name Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America, plus he was a Catholic." Everyone knew that Christopher Columbus was not the first person to even get close to this continent. That Eric the Red and the Norsemen and a group of African explorers who you never heard of called the Olmecs had already been in this country. So it was a political decision for Christopher Columbus to be named the discoverer of America. So now that teachers and administrators and professors know that Christopher Columbus did not discover America, why are we still teaching it in school? This country was founded on a racist Christian ethic. We need to have slavery. We need to own other people, but we can't call it owning other people, because that's in violation of the Bible. That's contrary to the teachings in the Bible. That's contrary to the teachings of Jesus Christ. So what can we do? Let's, instead of them calling Africans, instead of us calling Africans humans, let's call them property. Let's call them chattel. So if we call these Africans chattel or property, we're not calling them human beings. So if we think of them as a chair or a table, then we're not violating the teachings in the Bible and the teachings of Jesus Christ. So this country, founded on a Christian ethic, took an entire race of people based on the hue of their skin and referred to them as property or chattel. And thus started a vile free labor economy. Every religious denomination in this country owned slaves, owned enslaved persons. In 1836, Georgetown College, now Georgetown University, founded by Jesuit priests. Jesuit means son of Jesus. They got in trouble keeping the doors of Georgetown College open, so these son of Jesus Catholic priests sold 272 of their slaves, which gave them $115,000, $6 million in today's money. So now the question is, why would Catholic priests own slaves? 1845, the Southern Baptist Convention was founded in Augusta, Georgia, for the sole purpose of supporting slavery. 1820, there were more millionaires out of the state of Mississippi as related to slaves and agriculture than any other state in this country. 1840, there were 5 million slaves in this country, worth 60% of the total value of this country. So we made people, white folk in this country, obscenely wealthy. And whenever there's a conversation about reparations, we laugh about it. White folk laugh about it, and some of us laugh with them. Paul Revere. Tell me something about Paul Revere. Well, Mr. Hurst, Paul Revere got on his horse and he rode from Lexington to Concord saying, "To arms, the British or the Redcoats are coming." How did you find that out? I was taught that in school. Don't you believe a word that they taught you. That did not happen. Betsy Ross did not sew the first flag. Benjamin Franklin did not put a key on a kite and fly it up in the air to let lightning strike the key, thereby making Benjamin Franklin the discoverer of electricity. That did not happen. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, words written by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence. And when he wrote those words, he owned more slaves in Albemarle County, Virginia, than any other person in that county. Thomas Jefferson took it a step further. There was an enslaved person that he owned. Her name was Sarah Sally Hemings. She had 6 children from him. That was finally proven through DNA testing in 2002. She had her first child when she was 14, which makes Thomas Jefferson a Francis Scott Key was an elitist and a slave owner. In the War of 1812, the British said to slaves and former slaves, to enslaved persons, "If you come and fight with us against America, we will give you your freedom and give you some place to stay." I said that to a group of college students at the University of North Florida. A black female student stood up and said, "Mr. Hurst, that's terrible. Why would they fight with Britain against this country? If you got me in chains, I will fight with anybody against you." So the British started a division called the Colonial Marines. And a few months later, they came up against a group of men led by Francis Scott Key, and the Colonial Marines whipped them pretty good. A few months later, Francis Scott Key was on a British ship in the harbor of Baltimore, begging for the release of one of his friends, a Dr. William Beans, who had been captured by the British. He was not captured himself, as some of your history books will say. While he was begging for the release of Dr. Beans, the British fired on Fort McHenry, the American fort in the harbor of Baltimore, and the fort fell to the British. And in the course of the fort falling, a number of colonial Marines were killed. Francis Scott Key started writing his poem to Fort McHenry. And Reverend, I'm not going to ask this question because I know that Mount Sinai, there are 4 verses to the Star-Spangled Banner. The 3rd verse is the most racist verse that you will read, where he talked about how glad he felt to see those colonial Marines killed during this battle, making up for the fact that they had polluted this country. Star-Spangled Banner has everything to do with war, has nothing to do with patriotism. And we got angry with Colin Kaepernick for kneeling to protest American racism and police brutality. But let's take it a step further. Give me the next one, Eric. The only successful slave revolt in this hemisphere was conducted by or led by Toussaint Louverture. And slave revolts are not diplomatic. There were slave revolts throughout slavery in this country that you won't read about in the history books. And the reason you won't read about the slave revolts in this country in the history books, because if you don't read about how dissatisfied Africans were in slavery, you would think then that they enjoyed being enslaved, which white folk would make you believe. Oh, they didn't say anything, so they enjoyed. They were in. A state representative said if it were not for slavery, she would be going to church in a tree. So Toussaint Louverture led this slave revolt, and it frightened the French and American and the British. And they put a blockade around Haiti to keep the word from getting out. A blockade that many people say exists today. There's a reason why Haiti is still the poorest country in this hemisphere. Toussaint Louverture is known as the father of Haiti. Not only did he lead this successful revolt, but he also led his forces and they defeated Napoleon in the hills of Central America. And Napoleon could not control the shipping routes. So Napoleon had to sell the Louisiana Territory to this country. So the history of Toussaint Louverture, whose name you will not read in an American history book, the history of Toussaint Louverture and the history of this country are inextricably bound. And you won't read it. I'm getting close. I had some nice pictures for you, but I can't show them, so I'd have to walk you through them now. Three Musketeers, Count of Monte Cristo, The Man in the Iron Mask, 3 classic literary stories. And those of you who read about those stories in school were not told that the writer of all 3 of those stories, Alexander Dumas, was black. You were not told that Alexander Pushkin, black, was the father of Russian literature. You were not told that John James Audubon, for whom the Audubon Society is named and one of the foremost bird experts in the world, was black. You were not told that St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the seminal figures in Christianity and Christian philosophy, was black. St. Augustine is named for St. Augustine of Hippo. Queen Charlotte is the great, great, great grandmother of the current Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth II. Yes, she was black. Ludwig van Beethoven. Father was African, grandfather was African. He was black. And now that people are beginning to realize, although these names are not in your history books as such, now musicologists are now saying, oh yeah, when I listen to the 5th and the 9th century, I can hear those African rhythms in his symphony works. They couldn't hear them before, but now they hear them. Although some white folk don't want to give up on Ludwig van Beethoven. They'll let you have some of the others, but not one of the classicists. I spoke to a Unitarian church reverend last year in Orlando, right out from Orlando. And when I said that to them, and I always tell people when I'm speaking, keep your iPad, your iPhones, your iPads, your laptops, your tablets on and look it up. Just make sure when you challenge me after you look up something and you think I'm incorrect, make sure you know what you're talking about. So when I talked about Beethoven, the fingers went to rolling. Yes, sir. Mr. Hurst, I've got a picture here of Beethoven, and he looks mighty white to me. So, white male. White female, 3 seats down from him, said, I looked up Beethoven too, and I see where his father was African and his grandfather was African. So I went back to the first gentleman who said he had a picture of Beethoven and he looked white to him. I said, anything else you want to add? So he put his hand down. It is not important that they teach these lies unless they teach them as lies. Don't teach a lie and represent it as the truth. Give me the next one, Eric. All of us know that Eli Whitney is given credit for inventing the cotton gin, although the Bureau of Patents will tell you there are 3,000 inventions by enslaved persons during slavery that they could not get credit for because enslaved persons could not get credit for inventions. Their owners. So we know that Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin according to history. We don't know that Benjamin Banneker laid out the city of Washington, D.C. and invented the first movable clock. We don't know that Daniel Hale Williams performed the first successful heart surgery. We don't know that Charles Drew classified blood plasma. We don't know that Matt Henson was the first person to set foot on the North Pole. We don't know that Jan Matzeliger put a machine together that puts the body of a shoe to the sole of the shoe. We don't know that Garrett Morgan invented a variation of the traffic light and also invented the gas mask. We don't know that Granville Woods invented an electrical engineering device on a train that allows an engineer to know when another train is near. We don't know that Dr. Percy Julian invented the cortisoid for rheumatoid arthritis. And we don't know that Elijah McCoy, 45 inventions, including 15 for long-distance trucking and lubrication. And when you talk about the real McCoy, you're talking about Elijah McCoy. Let me close with these 3 Jacksonville natives. Bob Hayes graduated from Reverend Matthew William Gilbert Junior Senior High School on the East Side. He went to Florida A&M on a football scholarship in 1960. 1964, he went to the Olympics. Won the 100-meter dash in world record time. Anchored the 400-meter relay in next to last place. Ran the fastest anchor in the history of the Summer Olympics in winning the 400-meter relay. As the world's fastest human in 1964, he was an international sports hero. Yet he could not sleep in a downtown hotel or eat in a downtown restaurant in Jacksonville. He was drafted as a future by the Dallas Cowboys. The Cowboys won the Super Bowl in 1972. By the way, my son, who is my Dallas Cowboy expert, is here with me, as is my daughter-in-law, Vanlin, who's sitting next to him. But when the Cowboys won the Super Bowl in the early 1970s, Bob Hayes became the only man in the history of sport to have both a Super Bowl championship ring and an Olympic gold medal. He was inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame posthumously in 2009. A. Philip Randolph graduated from Cookman Institute. Cookman Institute would later merge with Mary McLeod Bethune School for Girls, and thus the name Bethune-Cookman. But the Cookman Institute was in Jacksonville. In 1925, he was asked by black men who cleaned up after white folk on Pullman cars, on trains, to represent them as they sought a union contract. The Pullman Company was just like General Motors. For 12 years, from 1925 to 1937, A. Philip Randolph, who was born in Crescent City but moved to Jacksonville when he was 2 years old, he fought for these black men and won a contract in 1937, the most significant labor contract in the history of the labor movement. In the early 1940s, A. Philip Randolph went to Franklin D. Roosevelt and said, "Mr. President, you've got to do something about integrating the federal workforce." Mr. Randolph, now is not the time, Mr. President. If you don't do something about integrating the federal workforce, I am going to call a march on Washington and bring Negroes from all over the country to Washington, D.C. And 6 months later, Franklin D. Roosevelt established what's called the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which ultimately led to Katherine Johnson being hired as the predecessor to NASA. In the late 1940s, he went to President Truman and said, "Mr. President, you've got to do something about integrating the military." Mr. Randolph, now is not the time. Mr. President, if you don't, I will bring Negroes from all over this country. And Truman integrated the military. In 1963, he went to John Kennedy. Mr. President, you've got to do something about integrating public accommodations and do something about jobs for blacks in this country. Mr. Randolph, now is not the time. Well, Mr. President, I'm going to bring blacks from all over this country if you don't. And President Kennedy did not, and A. Philip Randolph did. The March on Washington was the most successful and the largest. It was more than 300,000 people. The most successful and the largest demonstration, civil rights demonstration in the history of this country. James Weldon Johnson was the first certified licensed black attorney in the state of Florida. I was glad to hear Reverend Gundy refer to Lift Every Voice and Sing as the Negro national hymn. James Weldon Johnson did not want his majestic hymn to be referred to as the Negro national anthem. And he did not write the song based on Abraham Lincoln. If you ask me to write a song about Reverend Gundy, then I should put Reverend Gundy's name in the song. If I'm going to write a song about Reverend Gundy, Abraham Lincoln's name is nowhere in Lift Every Voice and Sing. So let's dispel another myth about Lift Every Voice and Sing. But let's also understand that Lift Every Voice and Sing was written in Jacksonville on the campus of Bethel Baptist Institutional Church, where Jacksonville Baptist Academy had their classes. The Florida Baptist Academy. And the Florida Baptist Academy later became Florida Normal, later became Florida Memorial, and now is Florida Memorial University in Miami Gardens. James Weldon Johnson wrote Lift Every Voice and Sing to deal with the plight of black folk in this country who were being lynched on an average of 3 to 5 a week. So let me close with the third verse of this majestic and immortal hymn by this great humanitarian. James Weldon Johnson started the third verse by saying, God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy might led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray, lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee.